Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. The gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'd like to begin by thanking our witnesses for being here to discuss this important topic. Today we find ourselves at a critical juncture in America's energy future. Offshore oil and gas production has long been a pillar of our national energy security, supporting jobs, revenues, conservation, and economic growth. Yet recent trends paint a troubling picture. In early 2023, Gulf of America production stood at 1.9 million barrels per day. But by November of 2024, it had dropped to 1.6 barrels per day, the lowest level in years. This is the result of misguided policies and regulatory uncertainty from the last 4 years that has threatened the future of American energy dominance. The Biden administration's 2024 through 2029 leasing program slashed planned lease sales from an average of 24 in past programs put forth by both Republican and Democrat administrations, some of which included 40 or more sales, to just 3 in the Gulf of America and none in Alaska. Notably, the Biden administration's decision to offer 0 lease sales in Alaska jeopardizes the long-term economic stability and energy security of Alaskan citizens who rely on the Cook Inlet gas to heat their homes, where existing gas supply is projected to run out by 2027 without new development. This travesty wasn't enough for the Biden administration. In fact, in his final days in office, President Biden locked up 625 million acres, offshore acres from future leasing, sending a chilling message to long-term investors. To make matters worse, persistent delays under NEPA, ESA, and MMPA have cast a shadow over the future of offshore development. These regulatory obstacles discourage the capital investment that is essential for sustained production growth. Without immediate reforms, the long-term viability of offshore energy development is at a serious risk. The consequences are dire. COMESA revenues, which fund coastal restoration, hurricane protection, and infrastructure, have plunged from $9.6 billion in fiscal year 2022 to $5.3 billion in fiscal year 2024. Meanwhile, special interest environmental groups have utilized lawfare to vacate the biological opinion, or BIOP, in the Gulf. The BIOP vacatur, set for May 2025, will give these special interest groups the ability to endlessly challenge permits and projects in the Gulf. Their goal is clear: to create regulatory conditions so untenable that Gulf leasing and production collapses entirely. This would be a major win for radical environmental extremists, one that could drive up energy costs, force layoffs of thousands of workers, and threaten countless families' livelihoods, all for the sake of a single whale species with limited documented presence. States like Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi are being shortchanged, putting critical projects at risk. The American people deserve better. Offshore oil and gas jobs, which pay 29% higher than the national average, are at stake. Families in energy-producing communities are feeling the pain of lost job opportunities and lower wages, while consumers face rising prices. Thankfully, the radical left-wing and energy policies of the Biden administration have come to an end as the American public saw through the lies. They voted for energy dominance, not bureaucratic red tape, and that's exactly what we're going to restore. This subcommittee will hold BOEM and NIMFS and others accountable. We will push for more lease sales, faster permitting, and a return to American energy leadership. It's time to bring common sense back to energy policy and deliver security and prosperity to American workers and families. States and local residents depend on the revenue, the jobs, and affordable, clean, sustainable energy generated by offshore development to sustain their economies and their communities. I again want to thank the witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. I now yield to my colleague, Representative Ansari, the ranking member, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Stauber, and good morning to you all. I believe that we can all agree that we need to bring costs down for American families and deliver economic security to the communities that we represent. I see this economic hardship firsthand in Arizona's 3rd District, where families are being squeezed by high costs. Rent, groceries, and yes, energy costs are eating away at our household budgets. But if we're being serious about achieving this, we need to be honest about what's driving it. The cost of living crisis isn't happening because of some imaginary war on oil and gas. If anyone in this room still genuinely believes that more drilling will fix this problem, then we have not been paying attention to the facts and the data. The fossil fuel market is inherently volatile. Its prices are vulnerable to geopolitical shocks, global weather events, and the whims of other fossil fuel producing nations, including our adversaries, or even our own president's erratic tariff dictates. The United States is already producing more oil than ever before, and this is a point that I want to emphasize, more than any country in history has produced. Republicans' dirty drilling agenda will not make America any more energy dominant, and it will not drive prices down. Yet this industry continues to rake in billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded subsidies and tax breaks, including some that are almost a century old. Every year, the federal government hands at least $15 billion in direct subsidies to big oil, as well as a buffet of tax breaks. Americans are simply not seeing a return on this investment. In 2022, the federal government lost $2.1 billion from subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Continuing to throw money at big oil will only hurt American taxpayers. It's time to seriously reconsider our investments in the energy sector, especially offshore drilling. Again, if we could drill our way out of the affordability crisis, we would have done so. The answer is not more oil. Offshore drilling in particular creates an acute public health crisis. Right off of the Gulf Coast, which is a hotspot for offshore drilling, you can find onshore refineries and what is called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Here, the cancer risk is nearly 50 times the national average due to chemical plants and oil refineries. It's long past time that we put an end to sacrificing these communities for the sake of industry profit. And beyond these risks, we cannot have a conversation about offshore drilling without acknowledging the climate crisis. In my home state of Arizona, this threat is not some distant, far off, imaginary threat. It's here, it's now, it's getting worse every single year. Extreme heat is straining our infrastructure and driving up energy costs. Prolonged drought is threatening our water supply and agricultural sector. Wildfires are becoming more frequent and more devastating, and I've spent my career fighting for solutions. As a former Phoenix City Councilwoman, I oversaw investments in our electric vehicle industry, which, by the way, had unanimous bipartisan support. Before that, I helped develop the Paris Climate Agreement to ensure global action on climate change. And right now, as the ranking member of Energy and Mineral Resources, I will continue that fight by pushing to phase down offshore oil and gas production and scale up clean, affordable, American-made energy. And that brings me to offshore wind. I have to say, it has been baffling to watch my Republican colleagues bend over backwards to attack this industry. President Trump's offshore wind ban isn't just ridiculous, it's self-destructive. He's taking one of the best new ways to provide clean electricity off of the table at a time when our electricity needs are growing for the first time in decades. This is not just about fighting climate change. This is about building a brand new industry, being at the forefront of innovation, creating high-wage union jobs for American workers. It's about energy independence, about producing power here at home that is not subject to the whims of foreign dictators or global price shocks. This is a win-win-win-win-win. Offshore wind, among other renewable energy investments, will address the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis while building an industry that creates new opportunities for working-class Americans. Remaining beholden to big oil will only keep American taxpayers from a brighter, cleaner energy future. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before I pass it over to the full ranking chair, Representative Westerman, I ask unanimous consent that a letter dated June 2nd, 2021 to President Joe Biden from Louisiana School of Public Health, which shows that cancer rates in Louisiana's industrial corridor are no higher than the rest of the state. Without objection, so ordered. Representative, what's that? Okay, I'm going to go to my good friend, Representative Huffman, the ranking member of the full committee. Representative Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our witnesses. The administration and Republicans in Congress have made it abundantly clear that they believe, for some reason that is still not clear at all to me, that we're in an energy crisis, the solution to which is drilling. I think we're in a truth crisis. We're definitely in a constitutional crisis that my friends across the aisle seem perfectly comfortable with, but we are not in an energy crisis. The United States is currently producing more crude oil than any country ever in the history of the world. President Biden did not try to destroy entire energy sectors. That's what President Trump is doing right now. He has launched a war on offshore wind, which is a real solution to meet our growing electricity demands. It creates jobs, it creates affordable, clean energy. But no, for my Republican friends, the only offshore energy we can consider, apparently, is offshore oil and gas. You know, another actual crisis that we're in, which my friends continue to ignore, is the one that is devastating communities all over the country, all over the world. It's not a lack of oil. It's the surge in climate-driven disasters like the catastrophic wildfires in California. You know, fossil fuel is the primary cause of this extreme weather and this planetary crisis, and yet we continue to lavish this industry with subsidies and special favors even as they rake in record profits. Even by the most conservative estimates, the fossil fuel industry rakes in $15 billion in direct subsidies from the federal government every single year. That includes 13 tax breaks, below-market lease and royalty rates, and government-funded research and development, all on the taxpayer's dime. So what do we get in return for this incredible generosity? Well, according to several FTC complaints and class action lawsuits, big oil has been colluding with cartels from countries that pose national security threats to the United States to artificially inflate prices for American consumers. So we're here today at another fossil fuel cheerleading hearing because the Republican plan is to ignore things like collusion and price fixing, certainly ignore the climate crisis, and give even more public resources and more special favors to the oil and gas industry under the pretense that this will somehow protect American taxpayers from high prices. This is not a 21st century energy plan, it's a grift. According to a recent Wall Street Journal article, fossil fuel executives in the US and Saudi Arabia have told the president that they're not interested in boosting oil production. Why? Because they love high prices. High prices mean high profits. Fossil fuel industry currently holds over 2,000 leases in the Gulf of Mexico, covering 12 million acres. 80% of these leases are just sitting there, doing nothing, unused. By contrast, the offshore wind industry actually wants to support our growing energy needs. They don't want to put our coastal economies at risk. They won't collude with OPEC and gouge American consumers. They also won't cause environmental disasters. The risks to offshore drilling for our coastal economies and marine ecosystems is staggering. Where you drill, you spill. We have learned this time and again in California and so many other places. Now, the way I see it, we have a choice ahead of us. We can keep propping up a polluting industry that's rigging the system against everyday Americans in every way it can, killing the planet, befouling our coastal economies and ecosystems every time they have one of their catastrophic disasters and spills, or we can invest in a clean, fair, and secure energy future. I know where I stand. I'll keep fighting to protect our oceans, our climate, and our communities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before I go to the full chair of the Natural Resources, I ask unanimous consent to insert roll call 420 for HR 5376, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was supported by big oil and gas, and not one Republican voted for it. I ask unanimous consent to enter without objection. Chairman Westerman, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stauber, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. As we all know, offshore energy is a lifeline to America's energy security, to our economic strength, and our global competitiveness. Today, as we assess solutions to unlock our offshore energy potential, we are facing some critical questions. The first one, are we prepared to meet the world's rising energy demands? Can we outpace global competitors discovering new reserves, and how do we overcome regulatory roadblocks that threaten to sideline our U.S. innovation? These challenges, I believe, demand our full attention as we chart a path to secure America's offshore energy future. As we all know, the United States possesses vast offshore oil and gas reserves, but ongoing challenges are hindering our ability to fully harness them. In 2023, 8 deepwater discoveries were announced in the Gulf of Mexico, including significant finds by Talos Energy, Hess, and Murphy Oil. While these discoveries are encouraging, investment in exploration continues to face regulatory headwinds. In the past 12 months, the Gulf only saw 3 discoveries, which is a sharp decline from the previous year. This slowdown is further exacerbated by our current federal 5-year leasing program, which now includes only 3 lease sales between 2025 and 2029. And that is far short of the historical average and what is needed to sustain long-term energy security. Along with that, countries like China, Namibia, Brazil, and Algeria are moving full steam ahead in offshore development. A hostile regulatory environment, frivolous lawsuits, endless mandates, all the anti-energy agendas, along with other things, have allowed this to happen. It's hurting jobs, it's hurting innovation, and it's hurting revenues that come with offshore energy. We need to bring the investment back to the U.S. We need to restore U.S. energy dominance and prioritize our American energy. Last year, a federal judge vacated the 2020 Gulf of Mexico biological opinion, or BIOP. Unless a new BIOP is issued by May of this year, new and existing operations and exploration will come screeching to a halt. This ruling, prompted by concerns over alleged impacts to the Rice's well, puts Gulf production, jobs, and revenues into jeopardy. Additionally, the lengthy NEPA process has already delayed the first lease sale in the 5-year plan. Lease sale 262, which BOEM has shared, will not be held in 2025 as scheduled. The stakes have never been higher. With global energy demand rising to maintain leadership in offshore energy, we must implement reforms that increase certainty and foster streamlined exploration, innovation, and resource development to secure America's energy future and reaffirm our leadership on the global stage. While these barriers are significant, they're not insurmountable. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and the new administration to fix these issues as quickly as possible. I hope that our witnesses today will explain how long the process takes to develop offshore energy, and how a slowdown right now or a slowdown in the years past creates a dip in the horizon that is almost impossible to make up. Although we're producing a lot of energy right now, that doesn't mean that we're set to be able to produce a lot of energy in the future. Again, I want to thank Chairman Stauber for holding this hearing. I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman. We will now move to introduce our witnesses. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow. And at the end of the 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow all witnesses to testify before member questioning. Our first witness is Mr. Chett Chiasson, and he is the Executive Director at the Greater Lafourche Port Commission, and he is stationed in Cutoff, Louisiana. Mr. Chiasson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you and good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Chett Chiasson. I'm the Executive Director of the Greater Lafourche Port Commission, otherwise known as Port Fourchon. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. Mr. Chairman, I have more extensive written testimony as well as recent studies that I would like to submit for the record with your approval. Thank you.
Without objection.
Thank you. I applaud the committee for holding this hearing today on restoring energy dominance. I also want to recognize the continued efforts of our Congressman, Majority Leader Steve Scalise, on a host of issues, but particularly in the context of advocating for U.S. energy production, as well as recognizing the members of this committee for their advocacy of domestic offshore energy production over the years. Many members of this committee and others in Congress have visited Port Fourchon, and we encourage you to continue your visits. Truly, one must see this hub of U.S. energy activity to fully appreciate the scope of domestic energy exploration and production that benefits every corner of our country and its economy. What is key to unleashing American offshore energy is that policymakers must view energy policy over a continuum, with impacts lasting decades, far longer than any one Congress or presidential administration. This requires instilling a level of certainty in the federal regulatory process, certainty that can be relied upon by industry participants over a broad sector of our economy and by local governments, such as Port Fourchon, in order to make financial decisions today, which will come to fruition decades after those decisions are made. An integral part in providing services to our tenants and supporting the economy of our region and state is the necessity to plan for the future. Everything we do at Port Fourchon is impacted by federal and state policies, whether it's related to offshore energy production, environmental protection, or other matters. We actively work with our state and federal representatives on policy matters impacting our industry. But the most difficult aspect of working within a framework of federal, state, and local laws is the uncertainty of what will occur in the future with respect to these policies. The issue of lease sales and the development of a 5-year plan for Gulf of America leasing is a perfect example. Offshore operators who essentially are our customers' customers must plan multiple years in advance for investments in the hundreds of millions of dollars for projects that will take years to develop once permitted before they ever begin producing. Our tenants, in turn, must develop future plans to accommodate their customers' needs, which in turn requires Port Fourchon to anticipate our customers' future needs, nearly all of which requires us budgeting for future revenues and expenditures. A bold 5-year plan with a guaranteed number of lease sales and at a frequency to provide investments in American energy is the best indicator for us as to where Gulf energy activity will head in the near future. The recent API study, which I submit for the record, has detailed economic data supporting this. Next, part and parcel to the concept of certainty on lease sales are 2 other points. First, certainty on federal permitting over the vast array of matters which require permitting, and second, certainty on the timely delivery of infrastructure projects that support U.S. energy activities. I applaud this committee and others in Congress for your recent efforts on permit reform, but at its core, it must incorporate the notions of certainty and accountability. Certainty to provide those involved in domestic energy production with the ability to make large financial investments, and accountability on part of the federal agencies that have a role in permitting to deliver timely, rational, and legally sustainable decisions that are based upon the underlying goals of the statutes that they administer. Additionally, uncertainty in the industry due to poor policy causes business decisions to be made that impact the U.S.'s ability to explore and produce energy. According to a report by Westwood Global Energy, U.S. Gulf rig availability and utilization has plummeted due to the competitive disadvantage created by poor policy decisions. These decisions have long-lasting impacts on our ability to provide energy to our nation. Furthermore, timely approval of infrastructure projects or federal decisions impacted ongoing operations in support of energy activities are also important to unleashing American offshore energy. Port Fourchon has been seeking approval from the Corps of Engineers since 2016 to deepen its federal channel from an authorized depth of -24 feet to -30 feet. We have spent nearly 10 years in this project. We received a congressional authorization in 2020, yet we are still awaiting final Corps approval in order to begin dredging, and this is a project which has broad support due to its environmental restoration features. While I realize dredging and other infrastructure-related projects are largely outside of this committee's purview, from my vantage point, delivery of such projects are just as important to securing American energy dominance. The final issue that I would like to mention are the impacts of regulatory interpretations on activities currently underway. The current Rice's Will issue is an example of where federal policy significantly impacts commercial operations in the Gulf. I would like to stress that the efficiency of commercial maritime operations, as well as safety of vessels and mariners operating in the Gulf, must at all times be given great consideration. This concludes my remarks. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is Mr. T. Lane Wilson, and he is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Williams Companies, and he is stationed in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Mr. Wilson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Stauber, Ranking Member Ansari, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Lane Wilson, and I am a Senior Vice President and the General Counsel at Williams. I'm honored to be invited to discuss ways we can work together to unleash American energy. Williams is the largest midstream service provider in the Gulf of America, with over 2,500 miles of onshore and offshore gathering and transmission pipelines, transporting both crude oil and natural gas in the Gulf Coast area. We own and operate oil pipelines capable of safely transporting 660,000 barrels per day of oil from offshore to onshore terminals along the Gulf Coast. And we own and operate natural gas gathering lines capable of moving 3.15 BCF per day from offshore production across the Gulf to our processing plants. We also own and operate significant assets in the Gulf Coast states. For example, Gulfstream is an interstate natural gas pipeline that safely and reliably transports gas from the Mobile, Alabama area across the Gulf, some 745 miles to the Tampa, Florida area to serve Florida's rapidly growing residential power generation needs. Our investment in offshore and associated onshore energy infrastructure creates thousands of direct and indirect jobs, supporting skilled labor and stimulating local economies. And by enabling natural gas exports through liquefied natural gas facilities, Williams helps the U.S. capitalize on global energy demand, boosting national wealth and trade surpluses. Pipelines are the safest, cleanest, and most cost-efficient means of transporting natural gas, and demand for natural gas is only increasing. Lower 48 gas demand growth driven by LNG exports, electrification, data center demand, and overall increases in energy consumption is expected to more than double by 2030, with an additional 13.2 BCF per day of demand expected from 2024 through 2030. Electricity demand is experiencing 10 times faster growth per year this decade than what was seen in previous decades, driven by electrification, the energy needs of artificial intelligence, and the emergence of new large load data centers. U.S. data center power demand is expected to more than double by 2030, requiring as much as 4 BCF per day of incremental gas demand. Americans cannot rely on intermittent sources of energy, like wind and solar, to meet demand during peak hours or extended weather events. The U.S. saw record high natural gas demand in 2023, even as wind and solar grew. Reliable natural gas is needed for peak days and to back up intermittent resources. The U.S. has the abundant energy resources to meet this need, but a Byzantine permitting system coupled with fervent opposition to human advancement from activist groups makes building infrastructure nearly impossible. To ensure America's long-term competitiveness, Congress must prioritize permitting reform. America's permitting system is labyrinthian by any reasonable measure, requiring projects to receive duplicative approvals from dozens of federal and state agencies. Beyond the permitting process, there are also significant litigation risks from groups weaponizing regulatory loopholes and misusing environmental statutes to delay and cancel projects. There are 3 key steps to streamlining the regulatory process that Congress can take to help ensure that we have the infrastructure needed to meet growing energy demands. First, policymakers need to empower FERC and bring the Clean Water Act 401 review into the FERC NEPA process. Second, Congress needs to reform judicial review, empowering the courts to fairly review the actions and decisions of government agencies. And lastly, but equally as important, is fixing NEPA to limit litigation to the purpose of that statute. Pipelines power America, and our country and its citizens have received the benefits of this large-scale infrastructure for years. Real permitting reform will put the U.S. on a path to meet the ever-growing need for energy and a path to achieve human flourishing. The changes will cost taxpayers nothing while paying a world of dividends. Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the committee, this concludes my prepared statement. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is Ms. Peg Howell, and she is the founder of Stop Offshore Drilling in the Atlantic, and she is based in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Ms. Howell, welcome. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stauber, Ranking Member Ansari, and honorable members of the subcommittee. My name is Peg Howell. Thank you for inviting me back to testify before the subcommittee today. I look forward to a robust conversation about American energy and costs, including the negative impacts that new offshore drilling and related activities would have on the people who live, work, and vacation on coastlines previously untouched by the oil and gas industry. I would like to submit my written testimony for the record. In 1971, I was the first female petroleum engineer to graduate from Marietta College, where I earned my Bachelor of Science in Petroleum Engineering cum laude and graduated at the top of my engineering class. 3 years later, I became the first female company man, which is the oil field's term for drilling rig supervisor in the Gulf of Mexico. I've worked for Chevron, Mobil, Marathon oil companies in the US and in the North Sea. I later earned an MBA from Harvard Business School and ran my own consulting business for more than 20 years. I strongly supported the oil industry, especially through the new technologies developed in onshore drilling. But my support for the offshore industry ended 15 years ago on April 20th, 2010, with the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico. Clearly, offshore companies had focused on getting deeper cheaper, which was our catchphrase when I was a drilling engineer, than they were on the safety of their employees and the quality of life of coastal citizens. This one human mistake caused roughly 3.2 million barrels of oil to be released into the Gulf. The impact of this one disaster cost 11 workers their lives. Many of those who survived suffer from PTSD. The oil spill oiled 1,300 miles of shoreline across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. The impact of the disaster on the recreation industry was $500 million. The spill killed an unprecedented number of marine mammals, turtles, and birds. Deep water fish populations near the spill site decreased by 50 to 80%. Fishermen saw their livelihoods erased as state and federal fisheries in the Gulf were closed, and the loss to the seafood industry alone was nearly $1 billion. One accident. Last year, 14 years after the catastrophe, scientists have reported that marine life at the site continues to exhibit signs of stress and slow recovery. The overall biodiversity remains significantly reduced compared to pre-disaster levels. Learning about the human and marine costs prompted my coastal advocacy. In the fall of 2013, I started noticing op-eds in my local Pawleys Island, South Carolina newspaper written by local and state officials supporting oil and gas exploration in the Atlantic. I was shocked to see our elected representatives were advocating putting our coast and economy at risk. And out of this, I learned about the proposals in the 2019 to 2024 offshore drilling program, which would have put 90% of the US waters, including the Atlantic and Pacific coast and eastern Gulf of Mexico, at risk. I and others formed a group called Stop Offshore Drilling in the Atlantic, or SODA, to fight along the Atlantic coast against offshore drilling. We joined with partners across the state and across the East Coast, one of which was BAPAC, the Business Alliance for Protecting the Atlantic Coast, BAPAC is supported by 42,000-plus businesses and 500,000 commercial fishing families from Florida to Maine. Our advocacy here in Washington was instrumental in having the Obama administration reject seismic testing in January 2017. We also worked together to obtain President Trump's support to halt offshore drilling plans for the South Atlantic in 2020. We welcome President Trump's use of his Section 12A authority to protect the Atlantic waters. We also welcome President Joe Biden's building upon President Trump's protection this past January 6th. These permanent withdrawals are vital to the well-being of the Atlantic. It seems that we are here today, though, not about offshore drilling or energy independence, as our country is energy independent and has been since 2018. What we're about is, as Chairman Westerman commented, the fact that we have money that goes to the U.S. Treasury, but and it is depleting because we are a nation addicted to a depletable resource. Some feel we have to keep offering new leases to feed the beast. As long as oil payments come our way, there's no incentive to expand to other forms of energy like wind and solar power. This is the harsh reality of America's addiction to oil and gas. What we need to do now is to transition and continue our growth of offshore wind and to build up our supplies for the future. In summary, we do not need to drill in the Atlantic to achieve energy dominance or energy security. We already have that. The Atlantic can, however, contribute to the U.S. energy production through responsibly sited offshore and onshore wind. Any retreat from this opportunity is a mistake and a waste of the Atlantic's clean, renewable, and rich wind resources. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is Mr. Tim Tarpley, and he is president of the Energy Workforce and Technology Council, and he is based in Houston, Texas. Mr. Tarpley, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Stauber, Ranking Member Ansari, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to be here today. My name is Tim Tarpley, and I'm president of the Energy Workforce and Technology Council. The Energy Workforce and Technology Council is the national trade association for the energy, technology, and services sector, representing over 220 companies and employing more than 650,000 energy workers, manufacturers, and innovators in the energy supply chain. Our workforce is in all 50 states, with representation in the vast majority of congressional districts across the country. Our membership ranges from large energy service companies with global operations all the way down to small family-owned well-servicing companies that operate locally. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to truly maximize the United States' energy potential and to make policy changes that will benefit this country's workforce, our economy, and our energy security for years to come. Energy production has long been the backbone of the United States' national security. Unfortunately, the United States has not fully taken advantage of our opportunity for energy dominance. The past 4 years have seen opportunities squandered and put on hold. The Biden administration's ill-advised LNG permitting pause is an example of this. U.S. offshore policy is another glaring example. The Biden administration leased fewer acres for offshore oil and gas production than any other modern administration since World War II. President Biden's 2024 to 2029 program called for a mere 3 lease sales. This pause and slow walk of offshore leasing has led investors, Gulf communities, and the offshore workforce to lose confidence in the federal government's ability to effectively manage this resource. All of these delays have occurred despite the fact that the United States and the world will need a lot more energy in the coming decades. In fact, the U.S. Energy Information Administration predicts that the worldwide demand for all forms of energy will increase by 50% by 2050. These delays and bureaucratic roadblocks hurt our energy security along with our economy. Currently, the Gulf of America offshore oil and natural gas industry supports an estimated 370,000 jobs in the United States and contributed approximately $30.8 billion to the U.S. GDP. Looking ahead, annual offshore oil and gas investment is expected to remain significant, averaging nearly $30 billion per year between 2025 and 2040. Economic analysis by the Energy and Industrial Advisor Partners suggests that adding new leasing opportunities could further boost investment and spending by $4.8 billion annually, supporting an additional 55,000 jobs and adding $4.6 billion to the U.S. GDP each year. While the U.S. has delayed and slow-walked the full development of our offshore resources, our competitors abroad have moved rapidly to develop their own. In the Middle East, offshore upstream spending in the region has surpassed all others for the first time. Mammoth projects in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE are underway. According to Rystad, the area's offshore spending growth looks set to continue from $33 billion last year to $41 billion in 2025. These countries are tapping into their vast offshore resources to meet rising global energy demand. Why aren't we? Restricting U.S. offshore production just means that the development will go somewhere else. The demand will not go away. Other countries will just reap the benefits. The U.S. Gulf boasts approximately half the carbon intensity of other producing regions. We simply do it better. From 2011 to 2017, according to TBOEM, carbon emissions from the U.S. Gulf operations decreased by approximately 60%, even as oil production increased by over 35%. How do we do this? We do it because we have the best technology and the best expertise. What can Congress do? First, Congress should act to stop bureaucratic delay tactics and follow the intent of OSCLA to hold annual lease sales. We fully support the actions taken by President Trump and Secretary Burgum in their executive orders directing agencies to resume regularly scheduled lease sales. However, it is important that Congress solidify this into law as strongly as possible to prevent future administrations from delays. Congress can also codify the 2020 biological opinion as legal and sufficient to prevent additional threats of shutdowns like those that occurred last year regarding the Rice's whale, North Atlantic right whale, and other species. Additionally, legislative action taken by Congress should codify and ensure that the multiple NEPA reviews that have already occurred for specific lease sales in the Gulf will be considered sufficient going forward. I also urge Congress to work on passing comprehensive permitting reform as soon as possible. Permitting reform is necessary for developing upstream oil and gas projects, geological and geophysical surveying, and construction and operation of production facilities in the Gulf. To fully realize the potential of the U.S. offshore, additional offtake for oil and natural gas pipelines will be necessary in addition to repairs of the current infrastructure in the coming decades. In 2000, on average, it took 2 years for an energy infrastructure project to go from the point of its first permit being filed to becoming operational in the United States. Over 20 years later, in 2022, the average was over 5 years. The U.S. Gulf is a tremendous resource that can benefit the economy and energy security of the United States and its citizens. Unfortunately, U.S. energy policy back and forth and long-term uncertainty have not allowed us to fully exploit this incredible resource. The time to end that is now. I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony this morning. The chair will now recognize members for 5 minutes of questions, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Chiasson, you testified that Port Fourchon services 90% of the deepwater rigs in the Gulf of America, and that Gulf production contributes nearly 20% of the nation's oil supply. What would happen to United States energy prices if federal leasing and permitting delays continue to disrupt your port's operations?
Simply, energy prices would remain high, including gas prices at the pump. Again, they would stay elevated, and that impacts every household in America.
The need for energy is just increasing. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
If we have to win the AI war, we need energy. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Mr. Wilson, you mentioned that oil and gas produced in the Gulf has a carbon intensity that is nearly a half of the global average for deep water fields. Can you explain how maintaining Gulf production helps reduce global emissions while keeping energy affordable, safe, and clean for American families?
Thank you, Congressman. The emissions footprint in the Gulf is less than half because we don't vent, we don't flare like other countries do. If we do not produce this energy, China will produce it, Iran will produce it, and Russia will produce it with a much higher emissions footprint. This energy comes, the oil and the gas from the Gulf comes directly into the domestic continental United States. It allows us to maintain low and stable natural gas prices and low and stable oil prices.
Thank you. Mr. Tarpley, your testimony emphasized that delays in lease sales and permitting have caused job losses and reduced GDP. How quickly could U.S. offshore investment and job growth rebound if Congress implemented permitting reform and guaranteed lease sales?
Mr. Chairman, I think it could be quite quick. In fact, a study has shown that we could have a $4.8 billion a year in additional revenue by 2040 with additional leasing and permitting reform. We could also support 55,000 additional jobs in the Gulf. That's very significant, and it could happen quite quickly.
Give me the number of jobs again.
55,000.
55,000 jobs. You know, other countries are recognizing the need to meet increasing demand, energy demand, and are aggressively expanding their offshore oil and gas industries. Is that correct?
That is correct.
What lessons can Congress learn about what these countries have done to create more stable investment environment for U.S. offshore development? In other words, how do we bring these investments back to the United States instead of these other countries that are eager to responsibly develop their own resources?
Regulatory certainty is the key, Mr. Chairman. A offshore oil and gas production facility costs between $500 million to as much as $1 billion. It might take 10 years between getting the lease to get to first oil. That's a huge financial investment, and when you add regulatory uncertainty to that, it's a harder decision to make. Other countries have recognized that and are actively trying to pull in that investment to their basins.
I think we talk about it in the industry, and it's not just in the energy industries, it's in the mining industries and other. The certainty for permitting reform is increasingly important for the investment that needs to follow. Mr. Chiasson, I was down at Port Fourchon on a trip a couple years ago. We spoke. I recall being in a room, full of industry experts, and this was under the Biden administration. They were begging us to change the direction of this country. And as we know, for instance, the LNG exports. We know now that Speaker Johnson, when he spoke to President Biden had no idea he signed a ban. He told Speaker Johnson that he thought he was signing a study of energy. That's unacceptable in my mind. I would just like to say that I brought this up on the House floor last week. 37 below in my hometown last week. That's with the wind chill. I've got 6 children, 5 still at home. When it's 37 below and colder, I need reliable, clean, affordable energy. The windmills aren't going in northern Minnesota. They're frozen. The sun may not be shining. My 90-year-old mother and my 91-year-old father to live comfortably in that cold weather for long periods of time. It's affordable, reliable, clean, non-intermittent energy that they need to stay alive. I will now recognize, my time's up, I will now recognize Representative Ansari, the ranking member, for her 5 minutes. You're going to yield. Okay, you're up, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Being new to the committee, I really do want to dig in a little bit on some of the infrastructure challenges that we're experiencing as it relates to addressing the energy crisis that, like the chair, I share and feel the pressure of for my constituents in my home district. But I want to get down to some of the details of while we are, as Ms. Howell pointed out, energy independent and have been since 2018, why we are exporting more than we are importing to, in my view, the detriment of our constituents and addressing this energy crisis. But before I get there, I want to hone in a little bit, representing a coastal community, Maryland, Chesapeake Bay, really concerned about making sure that we are responsibly addressing some of these challenges. And Ms. Howell, thank you for bringing up the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. It's chilling to think what a similar disaster would look like for my constituents, for my state. It would be devastating. We talk about the economy, absolutely devastating, not just to the watermen and the fishing community, but so much of my economy relies on a clean and healthy Chesapeake Bay and ecosystem. So particularly interested in, the chair mentioned some lessons learned, and I would just like to kind of dig through some of those lessons. And this is for anybody on the panel, but can we talk about some of the lessons learned from the Deepwater Horizon disaster? How do we avoid that moving forward? How do we ensure that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul here?
I'd like to take that up if I can. The lessons of Deepwater Horizon are myriad. I think the most important lesson is that the failure that day was due to one man's decision. And his decision was made to cut costs. It's all been documented very clearly. And his decision cost lives and harm to the Gulf of Mexico, the economies, the fishermen, the tourism, and so forth. When we looked at what could happen to the South Carolina coast in our organization, the important thing to remember is it's not like somebody just goes offshore and they drill a well and they go on home and everything's fine and we have more reserves. In order to support offshore drilling, you need onshore infrastructure, and the infrastructure has to go somewhere. And quite likely, it would end up in Winyah Bay, which is where I lived in South Carolina, or near Chesapeake Bay. So while I admire all the work that Port Fourchon has done over the years, even Port Fourchon is deeply at risk annually from hurricanes. It has been flooded many times. So all of the chemicals and infrastructure that is there is put underwater. I am particularly concerned for the East Coast, for the Chesapeake Bay, for Winyah Bay, and others that will have to suffer from the onshore impact and how that contrasts with our tourism economy. The Atlantic was developed as a tourist area, not like the Gulf. In 1953, the Gulf really started booming, and as a result, the Central and Western Gulf have become the oil field of today. We don't need that or want that in the Atlantic.
Thank you, Ms. Howell. To the rest of the panel, being new to this committee and new to energy policy, I'm particularly struck by this idea that we are exporting more than, we're importing, we are, thank you, we are importing 8.51 million barrels per day, but exporting 10.15 million barrels per day. I'm not quite sure the American people are understanding that we are energy independent and that we are exporting this significant resource out of the country. If you were explaining this to the average citizen, how do you respond to the fact that we're not keeping those resources stateside to the benefit of addressing these energy crises?
Congresswoman, I'll take the natural gas side of that. I think, and I'll mention on the crude oil side of that, I don't think our refineries are capable of processing the crude oil that we produce in this country, at least in the Permian Basin and other parts of the continental U.S. And so exporting that provides us with a source of revenue to the American people. And it's a product that we couldn't refine here in the U.S. On the natural gas front, we have more natural gas than we need in the U.S. We can export that natural gas. We can meet all of our exporting needs. We can also meet all of our energy demand needs with the natural gas we have. The problem is infrastructure. You have to be able to get that natural gas from the supply centers to the demand centers. If we can do that, then exporting that natural gas, just like crude oil, provides revenue to the American people. It allows us to produce. It allows the single atmosphere we have on this planet to experience fewer emissions because we do it cleaner than anybody else on the planet. And it benefits the American people as a whole.
May I just add to that, and Mr. Wilson, I'm sure you could speak to this. The natural gas that heats Chairman Stauber's home is likely not coming from the Gulf of Mexico, is it? Or would it come from any Gulf area or any offshore area? It comes from onshore. Is that correct?
I actually can't tell you where the natural gas comes that heats Mr. that
We will,
heats Congressman
we will
Stauber's
only
home.
take questions from the members. I appreciate that. Representative Elfreth, I want to apologize for not recognizing you by name. I apologize. It won't happen again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. We are now going to go to Representative Kagans for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chiasson, throughout my time in this committee, I've been surprised to learn just how closely intertwined the offshore oil and gas industry is with the offshore wind industry. The industries have similar manufacturing needs. They pull from a similarly trained, skilled workforce. And the same companies that build vessels for oil and gas have been doing so for offshore wind projects along the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. As you said in your testimony, the skills honed in our offshore oil and gas industry now fuel a burgeoning renewable sector, including offshore wind. And I represent Virginia's 2nd Congressional District, so down in Virginia Beach, which is home to a very new and still in construction offshore wind project with Dominion Energy. Also in Virginia, our governor and our Commonwealth has adopted an all-the-above energy approach. So we are very open-minded, especially in my district. So this committee has consistently advocated for an all-above energy strategy, seeking a balance that keeps energy affordable, jobs growing, and our economies robust in states across the country. We lead the world in the efficiency of our oil and gas production, but America should lead in every form of energy. So I'm just wondering if you could tell me, how do these two industries, the oil and gas industry and the offshore wind industry specifically, work together and complement each other? I know that in my district, also, we compete sometimes for workforces. It's been interesting to watch offshore wind develop and see some of even our ship repair, shipbuilding industries kind of complement and fill some gaps when they needed work with some of the offshore demand. So I'm just wondering how oil and gas and wind can work to complement each other.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. Look, I can tell you, it's no secret that I've been talking about a balanced approach to energy for our nation for many years now. I've been with the port for almost 20 years. With the advent of offshore wind, in particular offshore wind thought in the Gulf of Mexico, we have been talking about an energy addition for our country for all of those years, not to the detriment of oil and gas. We need to continue to produce that because we need it for our everyday lives. However, when it comes to everything that's been done in the offshore energy sector, when it comes to offshore oil and gas, that is absolutely transferable to offshore wind. In fact, customers of Port Fourchon, our users, were some of the many companies that built Block Island. We are actually retrofitting vessels in Port Fourchon at Bollinger Shipyard to work in the offshore wind industry in the Northeast. So it is absolutely transferable. Lessons learned over the years in the construction of offshore oil and gas projects can absolutely be transferred to offshore wind projects.
So they can exist peaceably and also complement each other if done correctly. Let's see, and for Mr. Wilson, my district, again, in Southeast Virginia, beautiful and unique region, home to some of the nation's most critical national security assets as well, including the Navy, and some of the most beautiful beaches and the nation's largest estuary, the Chesapeake Bay. Recreational and commercial boating and fishing are some of the region's biggest economic drivers, and the abundant wildlife and diverse ecosystems make the Atlantic coast and the Chesapeake a true national treasure. So for these reasons, my constituents and I have serious concerns about the potential impacts of offshore oil and gas development off our coast. At the same time, we recognize our region's skyrocketing energy needs, given the increase in data centers, especially in Virginia, and the needs of the Navy, as well as rising energy costs. So my question to you is, how can we ensure we're meeting our nation's energy needs, reducing foreign reliance, powering our own defense industry technologies, and reducing energy costs for the American people without threatening the delicate ecosystems and recreational economy by drilling offshore, especially in places like Virginia?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Williams has not advocated for production off the Atlantic coast. We happen to supply 90% of the natural gas that goes into Virginia through our Transco pipeline. As you know, Virginia is expected to triple its energy needs by 2030, double by 2030, triple by 2040. If we don't have the energy to supply the data centers you're talking about, we're going to lose ground on the national scale and on the world scale in terms of our national security. We have a current project, the Southeast Supply Enhancement Project, which will serve Virginia as well. It'll serve enough natural gas to provide energy for more than 9 million homes. We need to simplify our infrastructure permitting in this country so that those sorts of projects can go in. We take great care for the environment in and around our projects and great care for our communities in and around our projects. I'll just give you one quick example. A project like the Southeast Supply Enhancement, 20 years ago, we would have spent about $10 million on environmental permitting and achieved the same result we're going to achieve today, which is a very good result. Today, we're going to spend over $100 million, and we're going to take a lot more time. So that cost is being borne by the American consumer. So if we can streamline our permitting, it'll be cheaper for the American consumer, it'll give Virginia the energy it needs, and everyone will be better off.
Agreed, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Min for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. So first question for you all. How many of you have taken an economics introductory class? Can you raise your hand if you have? Okay, let the record reflect all 4 raised their hands. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar and remember the concept of negative externalities or negative external costs? Only Ms. Howell's raising her hand. Mr. Tarpley looked like he was about to. Okay, just as a refresher, you may remember from Econ 101, negative externalities describe the indirect or hidden negative costs sometimes created by an economic transaction. The classic example, of course, is downstream pollution, where a factory discharges its waste into a river, which in turn creates unclean water that leads to cancer, health issues, maybe disrupts the fishing industry downstream. The negative costs of this pollution are not paid for by the factory or its consumers, but are instead costs that society bears. We might call them hidden costs. Now, offshore drilling is another textbook example of an economic activity that produces large negative externalities or hidden costs. This is not a disputed point. As we all know, burning fossil fuels releases large amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, which has created a climate crisis that we are just beginning to wrap our heads around. According to the IMF, when you factor in these hidden costs related to carbon emissions, oil production costs our society over $7 trillion a year. We're seeing these costs accrue in the form of extreme temperatures across the world, including the 140-degree temperatures we saw in India last year, biblical-level disasters like wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, extreme drought and flooding, and the like. And here is the thing. In 100 years, when people look back at this time, they're going to say that the 2020s were uniquely benign, uniquely cool as far as our weather patterns. Our grandkids and great-grandkids are going to look back and say that these were the good old days. We are literally damning them to hell on earth unless we aggressively reduce our carbon emissions. The negative external costs of oil production are so large as to potentially be an existential threat to our civilization. Offshore drilling also produces other major hidden costs, which I want to briefly address. First, the threat of oil spills, which have been a recurring problem for California's coastlines over the years. In 2021, my district experienced a major oil spill off the coast of Huntington, which shut down our local coastal economy and brought outdoor recreation and tourism to a halt. And we dodged a bullet as this was a small spill of only 25,000 gallons. But here is the problem. It's increasingly becoming clear that, at least in California, the economics of offshore drilling mean it's a matter of when, not if, we will have additional oil spills. The oil rigs off our coast were built between the 1960s and 80s and are long past their shelf life. Production is in decline, and the original leaseholders have all long since sold off their leases to small wildcat companies, which have no incentive to invest meaningfully in safety and soundness. To put it simply, offshore drilling has become a ticking time bomb for our coastline. So, Mr. Tarpley, would you be surprised if I told you that California's coastal economy, our beautiful beaches and tourism and innovation that we generate, is quite valuable? Yes or no?
Yes.
You would be surprised? Okay.
I understand how valuable it is.
It produces $1.7 trillion a year in value, according to NOAA. Mr. Tarpley, I guess I'll just ask you again, would you be surprised if I told you that oil drilling off the coast of California is very minuscule by comparison?
That's correct.
That's right. Offshore oil drilling near California generates less than 0.006% of the value generated by our coastal economy. So I will just ask Ms. Howell, I'll switch to you. Do you think that the potential risks to California's coastal economy are justified by the tiny amount of oil being produced there?
No, absolutely. There's no reason, sorry.
Now, another major hidden cost associated with offshore drilling is decommissioning costs, which I really haven't heard addressed too much here. But once these wells run dry, you have to plug them so they don't leak, dismantle the infrastructure so they don't create long-term problems. This costs a lot of money. Today, over 78% of the 2,000-plus leases in U.S. waters or outside of U.S. waters are currently idle, which means the associated oil rigs are abandoned and need decommissioning. But instead of actually paying for these costs, all too often, oil companies abandon these obligations and declare bankruptcy. In the last 15 years, there have been more than 30 Chapter 11 bankruptcies of offshore operators, leaving U.S. taxpayers with $7.5 billion in liabilities. It's estimated that we have another $40 to $70 billion in further cleanup costs remaining, and these are paid for by the taxpayers. Is that not correct, Ms. Howell?
That's absolutely correct.
So I want to just close with this. You may remember that last May, Donald Trump, now the president, held a meeting with oil executives where he promised to slash environmental protections if the oil industry contributed $1 billion to his campaign. Perhaps coincidentally, in the months following, oil executives donated hundreds of million dollars to his campaign, as well as the campaign of many other Republicans campaigning on slashing our environmental regulations. This is the first hearing this committee's holding since that time. And I guess my question is, when you think about the merits, whatever you think about the merits of offshore drilling, do you think, and I'll ask this to Ms. Howell, that Americans might reasonably see this hearing as a form of corruption, where House Republicans are delivering on the pay-to-play promise that Donald Trump made last year to the oil industry?
Absolutely. The premise that we are.
I would request a point of order. I would request that the gentleman's words be taken down. I think
what
he is
basis?
I think that he has maligned every single person on this side of the aisle
I'm
in terms of
I'm
the
asking the
hearing.
witness if this
You
is a
have
reasonable
indicated
question.
that we are engaging in corruption.
No, I said, is it reasonable for
Mr.
Americans
Chairman,
to believe that,
the
based on
gentleman,
the things that we
may I
all read in the
speak?
newspapers?
The chair will
speak?
take a moment to consider.
Thank you.
The chair, after conferring, we're going to, at the moment, allow them to stand. We are going to review, those are the exact language.
Should she be allowed to answer the question? I asked her if it would be reasonable for people to assume that, the American people to assume that, or believe it.
We're out of time right now. If somebody yields your time, Mr. Min, you can do
Thank you.
that.
I yield back.
But we're going to review and make that determination as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Representative Hageman from Wyoming for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that the question at the beginning of the last set of questions was whether any of you had any economic background. My question for you is, do any of you understand the concept of opportunity costs?
Yes.
Okay, it's an important concept, isn't it?
Yes, it
I wish that the folks on the other side understood the concept of opportunity costs. I also wish that they understood the concept of energy poverty, because it is the policies that they
Point
have
of
been
order.
pushing
She's
forward.
suggesting that we don't understand the concept, and I would just rebut that. I think she's maligning our side here. I actually do understand the concept of opportunity costs.
Overruled.
The Port of Lafourche, Mr. Chett, Chiasson, did I say that correctly?
Chiasson, but that's.
Just, all right. The Port of Lafourche plays a critical role in offshore energy production, supporting a vast network of workers and suppliers across the country, including in Wyoming. Wyoming-based companies manufacture equipment and provide services that support offshore oil and gas operations, but restrictions on leasing impact supply chains beyond just the Gulf Coast. Gulf energy revenues benefit states throughout GOMESA, but Wyoming receives no similar revenue sharing from energy production on federal lands. Should Congress revisit how energy-producing states are compensated for leasing on federal lands and waters?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I do believe we need to re-look at revenue sharing.
Okay, and Mr. Wilson, Wyoming's natural gas industry is closely tied to Gulf Coast export facilities, which rely on a steady offshore oil and gas production. The Biden administration's regulatory delays for offshore leasing mirror policies restricting drilling on federal lands in Wyoming, raising concerns about a broader trend of federal overreach in U.S. energy policy. Wyoming's natural gas pipelines interconnect with Gulf LNG facilities. If offshore production is restricted, what impact would that have on Wyoming's ability to move natural gas to export markets?
Well, the natural gas market's a global market. It's also a national market. So any restrictions in any areas on natural land are going to impact other areas of production.
So it will have an impact on Wyoming if they shut off
I
the
think it'll
coast.
have an impact on all portions of the natural gas industry, yes.
From a legal perspective, do you see a coordinated effort by federal agencies to curtail U.S. energy production across multiple sectors?
I mean, what I can tell you is that over the last 4 years, we've seen more difficulty in acquiring permits. In the small E&P production that we do have, we've seen more difficulty in acquiring federal permits, although I will say that FERC is operating in a very efficient manner right now and has been for the last couple of years, but generally, yes.
Mr. Tarpley, restrictions on offshore leasing impact workforce mobility and job opportunities. Wyoming is rich in critical minerals and rare earth elements, which are essential for offshore drilling technologies. Federal leasing delays could disrupt domestic supply chains for these minerals. Offshore drilling requires specialized metals and components, some of which are sourced from Wyoming's mining industry. Have federal leasing delays impacted demand for domestically sourced critical minerals, pushing such production overseas?
I certainly think that regulatory slowdown and delays has affected demand, and it's also affected the workforce and everything throughout the supply chain. So yes.
So one of the things that has been very critically important that I have watched over the last 4 years relates to the idea, again, of opportunity costs. And when we talk about opportunity costs in the context of offshore drilling, Mr. Wilson, could you explain a little bit about what I might be referencing in that regard?
I hate to try to get in anyone's mind, but what I can tell you is that to the extent we are not producing it in the Gulf, somebody else is producing it. We have one atmosphere. An emission that occurs in Australia or Asia is no different than an emission that occurs in the US. We produce our oil and natural gas in the Gulf in a manner that is cleaner than anybody else in the world. And it seems like the last place we should begin if we're worried about emissions reductions is US oil and natural gas production.
Mr. Chiasson, did we see a decrease in domestic energy use in the last 4 years?
Domestic energy use, no.
Okay. Did we see a decrease in domestic energy production?
It has increased.
Okay.
Yes.
But our demand for energy is increasing essentially every day, isn't it?
Absolutely, and having a certainty in the process. Again, it was mentioned before, if we don't continue to lease lands and explore for oil and natural gas in other areas of the Gulf of Mexico, production will begin to decrease.
And we'll have to get it from somewhere else, won't we?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
Representative Hagman, we will be ruling on your point of order. The chair now recognizes Representative Rivas for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to focus on the public health crisis that offshore oil drilling causes. I represent the San Fernando Valley, specifically a part of the San Fernando Valley, which is in the city of Los Angeles, that has a history of environmental racism. It's plagued my community. It's where I grew up, went to school with kids that had asthma, families with lung disease, other health issues that are a result of redlining, of being surrounded by air pollution due to freeways and other polluting industries. And, my community has become a sacrifice zone, where the health of Black, brown, and low-income communities suffers for the benefit of these industries. And not dissimilar to how communities like Cancer Alley in the Gulf have become a sacrifice zone to offshore drilling. The reality is offshore drilling is creating a public health crisis and polluting our environment. And so my question is for Ms. Howell. Former President Biden announced the withdrawal of future oil and natural gas leasing for 88 million acres of Southern California coastline. On day one, President Trump, in his first day in office, he signed an executive order that would reverse this decision. If he's successful in this withdrawal, can you expand on how offshore drilling impacts the health of local communities like mine that have become a sacrifice zone?
Yes, thank you for that question. In 2 ways, health is impacted by offshore drilling. The first is directly by the onshore infrastructure, which you referred to as Cancer Alley, that's part of southern Louisiana that experiences significantly higher than average cancers and asthma and other health conditions. The onshore infrastructure that I alluded to before is the danger to the people who live onshore, obviously, and their health. An interesting story, when we started SODA, a friend of mine who's an African-American woman in Georgetown went to a meeting sponsored by the American petroleum industry in Charleston. They, in describing the benefits that they said that were going to come to our area, put a chart up on the wall of Winyah Bay, our Chesapeake Bay, and pointed to the area where they wanted to put the onshore infrastructure. It was the African-American community in Georgetown. So they target, clearly, they target communities that don't have the power and resources to be able to fight these things. So obviously, onshore infrastructure was really important to us. The second, of course, is the increase in CO2 emissions. The amount of CO2 emissions from fossil fuels needs to continue to be reduced. The impacts that we're seeing right now in terms of floods, fires, in Western North Carolina, a third of our state was impacted by Hurricane Helene. There are people still living in tents in the winter in the mountains because of the damage that was wrought directly related to offshore and onshore, for that matter, oil and gas emissions and the high CO2 content. Even Mr. Wilson's company, Williams, has been buying into carbon sequestration companies to be able to help address this issue. So I know it's also near and dear to them. We've got to do something about the CO2 emissions.
Thank you for sharing that. I think these impacts are devastating to communities, especially like you mentioned, those that have traditionally been seen as not having power. But it's one of the reasons I'm here. I'm a member of that community as a Latina, and that represents an environmental justice community. These are our families that are our grandparents, our children that are suffering the health impacts of this polluting industry. And, these disasters, are not limited to just the Atlantic coast. It's Southern California that has been a victim of the oil and gas industry. These disasters, they don't just impact our health, but just also our ocean economy, right? That a lot of us rely on or use for recreation, even though we don't live directly along the coast. Our tourism is affected, and industries like fishing that are critical to the economic success of our region. But healthy oceans and clean coasts, help a lot of these small businesses succeed, and we must preserve our coasts for future generations and protect these critical coastal economies. We have to protect our coast from drilling and work to transition to a clean energy economy so we can create a livable future for the next generation. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Higgins from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much am grateful to the committee for allowing me to wave on today. I'm going to speak to two of my bills that are pending, and I'm going to ask for consideration of committee members on both sides of the aisle. H.R. 513, the Offshore Leasing Authorities Act, and the Federal Lands and Waters Leasing Transparency Act. These bills are vital to restoring the certainty of offshore oil and gas leasing and ensuring America can continue as a global leader in energy production, job creation, and national security. Mr. Chairman, in the last days of the Biden-Harris administration, over 625 million acres were withdrawn from potential development. And I think it's important for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, particularly in this committee, to recognize that America has a responsibility to the entire world to lead the free world in the production of clean, affordable, transportable energy product. This is a vital role that we play, and although politically, a nation can trend one way or the other, depending upon the executive in power. That responsibility to lead the world in energy production never wanes. Because when the Biden administration closed 625 million acres to clean, safe, reliable production of affordable and transportable energy product, there was zero acreage closed in China and Russia. So the gentleman spoke to increased consumption anticipated over the course of the next couple of decades. The consumption's not going away. So if you care for your planet, which I do, then you should embrace the American energy industry, which produces the cleanest energy product in the entire world. It's quite simple. So threatening the future of energy production is exactly what happened when you closed 625 million acres, hampering states like Louisiana and undermining local economies that are tied to offshore production like Port Fourchon. The Offshore Leasing Authorities Act, my bill, 513, reverses these withdrawals and implements a stable, predictable framework for future leasing, ensuring that we remain the global leader that we're called upon to be in responsible energy production. Equally important, the Federal Lands and Waters Leasing Transparency Act addresses the long-standing challenges posed by current leasing process. Under the existing process, federal regulators often reject bids. There's not a time frame locked in. It doesn't work well. It must be streamlined. My bill addresses it. So I'm going to ask that the committee give due consideration to these bills in the coming weeks. And I encourage any communication from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle regarding, the righteousness of the direction that we should embrace for America's energy policy. I encourage those conversations, and I welcome the questions. Mr. Chiasson, welcome, sir. Thank you for being here. I'm honored to serve you and represent you. Given Port Fourchon's pivotal role in offshore energy operations, can you speak to what limiting significant acreage for production and prolonging lease approvals, what harm that would bring to America's economy, and how would it erode America's energy dominance in the world?
Certainly, and in this economic report that I produced for the record, it shows that API had EIAP do. It talks about the impacts of having a certainty and having lease sales and a certain lease sale, having a program, a 5-year plan that is continuous. And we have 2 lease sales a year in it, and it highlights the impact to the GDP, to construction, to jobs, and to all of those other economic data points that we love to talk about.
Significant impact on the gross domestic product, would you say, is what we're discussing here?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I thank the gentleman. I have further questions, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit to the panel in writing. Again, I'm very appreciative to being allowed to wave on to the committee, and I yield.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Representative Velasquez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Howell, I represent a district in New York that has been coping with the issue of oil spill, the one that took place in 1978 and again 2013 by the ExxonMobil spill. You highlighted how coastal communities bear the brunt of oil spills. Can you expand on these impacts, such as loss of tourism, fishing revenue, and long-term environmental damage, and how spills spread beyond their source?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, in South Carolina, we looked very closely at the revenue that the coast receives just from tourism, just a forecast of tourism, against the API's study of what they anticipated revenue would come to the state of South Carolina from offshore oil and gas drilling. The very conservative forecast we put together indicated that we received 26 times more income in South Carolina than the best case scenario that API put out. So oil to South Carolina is only worth 1/26th at best of South Carolina's benefit from offshore tourism. That doesn't even begin to address the seafood industry, the number of people who have moved to South Carolina, the real estate market, and so forth. To New Yorkers, you need to be on the lookout because the primary interest in the Atlantic is actually north of, toward the Chesapeake Bay on the northern coast of North Carolina. And that area is taken over in the ocean by what's called the Labrador Current. So any oil that would be spilled in that area would be moving up along the coast from the Labrador Current. So New York would definitely be seeing impacts of offshore spills.
I am really proud that New York banned oil and gas exploration, production, and development in our coastal waters.
Yes.
It is time for us to move beyond drilling on our coasts and look to expanding opportunities for clean energy like offshore wind. Under the Biden administration, there were 6 offshore wind lease sales in New York Bight, which are projected to generate 7 gigawatts of energy, enough to power 2 million homes. Yet the Trump administration announced they will block new leasing and pause permitting for offshore wind. Ms. Howell, why do you see offshore wind as a better opportunity for energy development in the Atlantic compared to drilling?
Well, certainly talking about clean, efficient, and inexpensive fuel, offshore wind is way ahead of anything oil can offer. It's important, I think, that this committee's jurisdiction includes wind development. And yet, the whole conversation that the president has put forward that we need offshore drilling to accomplish our energy needs, I find a limited view of your jurisdiction.
And can you talk about the long-term benefits to offshore wind?
Oh, sure. As Representative Min brought up, even after you get all the oil and gas out of the ground, you still have to decommission all the onshore structures. Onshore structures are a challenge to fishing and boating in the area. There are a variety of reasons you don't want to site offshore structures near a busy port like New York.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we go to Representative Ezel, the chair would like to, by unanimous consent, enter into the record a letter from Representative Velasquez and 6 other House Democrats from the great state of New York demanding that utilities immediately provide increased natural gas hookups in their districts despite opposing the very infrastructure that makes that possible. Without objection, Mr. Ezel, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here today and being a part of this. It's very important. I can't sit here and not be amazed at how much change has happened over a short period of time. In the 1980s, our leasing programs averaged about 40 scheduled sales each. Fast forward to 2024 under the Biden administration, not a single lease took place. In 2025, we can only cross our fingers and hope for a single sale opportunity in 2025. This is war on the American economy. While we have tools, resources, and workforce to produce our own energy, the United States has continued to rely on imports that weaken our national security and drive up prices for the American families. These policies, including the delayed 2024 through 2029 gas leasing program, have only made matters worse. Fortunately, President Trump signed an EO titled Unleashing American Energy on his first day in office. This action reverses the Biden administration's disastrous policies and puts the United States on a path not just toward energy independence, but also energy dominance. I look forward to building on the President's EO as I reintroduce a version of my good friend's Bill's former Representative Garrett Graves' Bridge Act soon. Mr. Chiasson, to ensure long-term energy security, offshore oil and gas must be consistent and sufficient to meet future needs. Mr. Chett, can you explain, Mr. Chiasson, can you explain the timeline for how long it takes oil and natural gas to be drilled, produced, and delivered to the consumer in context of the federal leasing program?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. Basically, it's about 10 years from lease being purchased to first production, and billions of dollars of investment, which makes a port like mine busy. So, it's important for us to understand that there's a long timeline, a long lead time to get to production from a lease.
Under the Biden administration's 2024 to 29 offshore five-year plan, only 3 lease sales are scheduled. Is that enough to ensure the flow of oil and gas without risking supply gaps?
No, sir, it is not.
How many lease sales per year are needed at a minimum to maintain our stable energy supply?
2 lease sales a year.
2 a year. Last Congress, oil and gas production in the Gulf of America was nearly shut down due to the Biden administration's allowing key authorizations like the biological opinion and NIPED's general permit to expire without new ones ready to take their place. How important is it that Congress to ensure that the permits and authorizations needed to develop American energy are predictable?
It's critically important for the certainty and continuum in the process, for jobs, and for just the standard of living in America.
Will better federal permitting lead to more investment in the Gulf of America and Mississippi, creating a better economy and more jobs?
That's the hope, yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I have enjoyed catching a lot of your fish down there out of Port Fourchon on more than one occasion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the ranker of this committee, Representative Ansari, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Not too long ago, it's my understanding that almost every Republican on this committee boasted of supporting an all-of-the-above energy portfolio, which did include wind and solar. But as clean energy began to threaten the fossil fuel market's dominance, it seems that the fossil fuel industry has gone on the offense, because when you threaten the fossil fuel industry, they tend to wage war. They have long bankrolled disinformation about renewable energy and climate change. This is well documented. The FBI has investigated Exxon lobbyists for a hack and leak operation that targeted hundreds of oil industry critics. Now, offshore wind is their target. As its development has taken off, fossil fuel interests are afraid that they could lose market dominance. So in a last-ditch attempt to hold on to their power, big oil is now funding groups that claim to be grassroots and for the environment. But in reality, these groups are working hard to convince people that wind turbines cause cancer and kill whales. It's shameless, it's desperate, and it's dishonest work. It's clear that these corporations have successfully lobbied President Trump and convinced him of these falsehoods as well. But just because the president is catering to big oil and is repeating their lies about wind turbines causing cancer doesn't mean that the rest of the world is changing course. So that brings me to my questions. Mr. Tarpley, do you know how much operational offshore wind capacity exists worldwide?
I do not.
So the answer is almost 81 gigawatts. That's enough energy to power 60 million homes. Also for you, Mr. Tarpley, do you know how much of that capacity is in China?
I do not.
More than half, 41 gigawatts. The United Kingdom is in second place with 14 gigawatts. The United States isn't even close. But we could be if we were dedicated to growing this essential and job-creating industry. Around the country, we have an opportunity to build some of the first floating offshore wind turbines in the world. We have the potential to export American innovation across the globe. But if we pause this industry, we'll lose that potential, and the industry will be taken over by our adversaries. Mr. Chiasson, this question is for you. With opportunities in shipbuilding, manufacturing, and more, Louisiana and Port Fourchon in particular stand to benefit from offshore wind. Is that correct?
Yes, we would benefit.
So if Trump succeeds in killing the offshore wind supply chain, we will be ceding American dominance to our adversaries. If he succeeds in killing the offshore wind supply chain, we will be ceding American opportunities to our adversaries. We could have ships from Louisiana built with iron and steel globe from Ohio and Minnesota servicing offshore wind farms across the globe, but instead it may just be from China. Instead of stepping up to win this competition, as the previous administration was doing, and instead of acknowledging that the climate crisis is real like the rest of the free-thinking world has done, Trump is betting on dominating the shrinking market of fossil fuels. It's like betting everything on being the world's biggest typewriter manufacturer in the 1990s. I understand that not long ago, many House Republicans here supported a technology-neutral approach. Given everything that's been said and the fact that we are losing this competition to our adversaries, I strongly urge my colleagues to reconsider this oil-only approach. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Begich from Alaska for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Ms. Howell. Do you support offshore drilling anywhere?
I think where it's already operating in the Gulf of Mexico, in the very specific area in the Gulf of Mexico, they're doing the best they can to keep clean oil coming to America.
Do you support?
Surprised?
I'm sorry?
Were you surprised?
I'm glad to hear that. You support that. Do you support offshore drilling in Africa, China, or other regions outside of the United States?
You know, those areas are mostly drilled by American companies and by the colleagues that I used to have who work the rigs in the Gulf. So I think it's important for the workforce that those jobs are available, and they're happy. My best friend has traveled all over the world drilling for other countries, and our oil companies benefited from that.
So you believe that they are operating with high quality, high standard practices because they're American drilling companies, even if they're overseas?
Most of the offshore drilling that is done by American oil companies, I've been on some of those rigs myself in the North Sea, I can say are of the same caliber as what's being drilled in the Gulf of Mexico.
Do you believe that the regions that they're drilling in overseas are any more or less valuable as ecosystems than U.S.-based ecosystems?
Of course they are.
So they are equivalent. They are equivalently valuable.
Yes.
Okay. So we've established that we
This is
have.
an international industry. We're talking about.
I understand that.
Okay.
So we've established that American companies have high standards regardless of where they're drilling. We've established that those ecosystems are no more or less valuable than ecosystems in the United States. So given those high standards and given the fact that we have equivalency among ecosystems, why would you then oppose offshore drilling by American companies in U.S. waters?
Because, thank you, sir, for that question. Because our coasts have already established economies that are not consistent with the onshore infrastructure and offshore drilling and the potential spills for offshore drilling. We have an incredible economy on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts that will be damaged by offshore drilling. It also strikes me as odd that we haven't talked at all about onshore drilling. We acknowledged at the very beginning our offshore resources are only 20% of U.S. supply. What's gone on in the Permian Basin and during the shale revolution has made America more secure than opening up one more lease in the Gulf of Mexico. So I don't understand the push, except to keep these folks employed, the push to continue to expand drilling in the Gulf. It doesn't make any sense.
So you mentioned that economic development is a strong consideration and existing economies are a strong consideration. So money matters to you.
Of course.
Okay.
I'm a good capitalist. I went to Harvard Business School.
So let me just take a moment and mention some of the terms that have been raised by colleagues today. Environmental racism, energy crisis, climate crisis, cancer alley, sacrifice zone, public health crisis, environmental justice, polluting industry, victim of the oil and gas industry. This is unhelpful rhetoric. It does not advance the quality of the conversation, nor is it data-driven.
Most of that rhetoric
I'm not
came from
referring
the
to you right now.
Republican side.
My time is limited. I appreciate that. The same voices that call on wind and solar, and they say that these are clean sources of energy, also, in a hearing here last week, called the mining necessary to support those forms of energy, they called that mining dirty. Are we talking about clean energy or are we talking about dirty energy? It's very confusing. And I think this is a duplicitous level of doublespeak that's actually code for let's not do anything in the United States and let's send development to jurisdictions with lower standards, poor records, and I think that's unhelpful, and it does not allow us to advance high standards that, as the witness acknowledges, are adopted and used by American energy companies. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much.
May I
Chair-
respond to
Chair-
that?
No, ma'am. The
Okay.
chair now recognizes Representative Levin for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be back in the Natural Resources Committee room. I couldn't get enough of natural resources. I had to come back. Good to see my friend Chairman Westerman as well. Sorry to be not in the conversations after 6 years on the committee. I can tell all the new folks this is a great committee. You're going to have a lot of good conversations and hopefully find some common ground. I have the great honor to represent California's 49th Congressional District in Southern California, 50 miles of beautiful coastline in Orange and San Diego counties. I'm biased, but I think it's the most beautiful district in the United States. Come visit anytime. And I think you all know that our economy relies very heavily on the vitality of the coast, of our beaches, our marine life, and all the ocean-dependent businesses that drive tourism and other activities. It's tens of thousands of local jobs and billions of dollars of economic activity in Orange County, where I live, and in San Diego County. And we know firsthand the real risks that offshore drilling poses to our community. And it's not theoretical. Just a few years ago, 126,000 gallon spill from a leaking pipeline covered an area larger than many cities, a very large area with oil. I remember being on a plane looking at it all and then going and seeing fish and birds and marine life just dead on the coasts of Orange County. That's why it's, I think, worth mentioning in this discussion today that the President and many here want to expand offshore drilling everywhere, and that includes potentially on the coast of Southern California. And I just want to remind my colleagues that a majority of the people that I serve, a wide majority, Republican elected leaders, Democratic elected leaders, cities that are 3-2 and 4-1, Republican cities, nobody really wants more drill rigs off the coast of Southern California. With that, I'll turn to my questions, and I'll start with Ms. Howell. The U.S. is already the #1 producer of oil and gas in the world. At this point, the more oil we produce domestically, the more we export rather than domestically consume. I hear the argument a lot that we should be producing more to solidify our own energy security, energy dominance. By the way, I want energy dominance too. I'll get to that later. But then at the same time, I hear that we want to double down on LNG exports. But it seems like simple math to me. The more you export, the less you have for domestic consumption. And some of the data I've seen from the Department of Energy supports that. They say that unconstrained exports of LNG would increase wholesale domestic natural gas prices by over 30%, translating to an increase in costs for the average American household by well over $100 per year. So, Ms. Howell, can you opine on that and discuss what you understand to be the impact of unrestrained LNG export?
Well, I think you certainly hit the nail on the head. Oil and gas is a limited, non-renewable resource. The more you produce and export, the less you have for your own needs domestically. Interestingly, no one has commented about the source of the LNG. This liquefied natural gas, the original natural gas, primarily comes from onshore. It is not that, there's not that much gas being drilled offshore right now. And to think that we are using our onshore supplies cheaper, easier to oversee, easier to produce, easier to drill, that the best stuff we have, we would prefer to get rid of than to other countries than to keep for our own future needs, I think is baffling. I'm also surprised that we're not talking about why it's so urgent that we expand offshore drilling. What's the why? We are the world's largest producer of oil and gas. Why in the world would we want to drill up those reserves now when they're worth much more to us down the road?
I appreciate your comments, and I would just add that what could be derived from Southern California is such a drop in the bucket compared to the overall picture that, given the environmental harm, the environmental risk, that's why it's overwhelmingly opposed by my local Republican and Democratic elected officials. I'll just close by saying it's great to be back in the room. I hope to come back from time to time. We all want energy dominance. I want to see clean energy dominance. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Representative Levin, you're always welcome in this community, and I appreciate your comments. Before we go on to Representative Hurd, I ask unanimous consent that the following documents be entered into today's record. It is from the S&P report that confirms the U.S. holds more than 35 years of economically recoverable natural gas reserves, approximately 1.3 trillion cubic feet. Without objection, we will go to Representative Hurd for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Mr. Wilson, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming. I represent Colorado's 3rd Congressional District, which is basically half of the land mass of the state, and part of the district includes the western slope, which does not have any offshore production, but we're very proud of our energy production in that part of the state. We are very rich in natural resources. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, my region provides 4% of the total crude oil and 8% of the nation's natural gas reserves. One impediment I know to increasing production and lowering costs for my constituents and for Americans across the country is the need for additional pipeline infrastructure. I understand that Williams owns and operates significant assets in my district, I think to the tune of 1,800 miles of pipeline and 200 good-paying jobs. Can you talk about some of the challenges Williams faces when it comes to pipeline capacity and permitting adequate infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for that question. The U.S. has increased its natural gas demand by 43% in the last 10 years. We've seen an increase in infrastructure related to natural gas of about 25%. That's not a recipe for good policy making. Our challenges and the reason why we are sort of out of balance in terms of the infrastructure and the demand comes directly from federal regulations under NEPA, comes from the Clean Water Act. And let me be clear, Williams is absolutely committed to complying with the Clean Water Act. We're absolutely committed to complying with every environmental regulation that we have. The problem is those regulations are duplicative. We get stuck in litigation over minor issues which don't change the environmental outcome of a project at all. And states that have decided that they just simply don't want more infrastructure, even though it increases their energy costs, have decided that they'll use the Clean Water Act as a weapon. So what we've asked Congress to do is to move that analysis and that permit into FERC. FERC already does a NEPA analysis. They already look at whether or not one of our projects impacts water, and they already reach conclusions that they don't substantially impact water. So why are we doing 2 different analyses of the same issue and then allowing a state on a local basis to veto an interstate pipeline project that's going to benefit both that state and states around it? So we need to reform NEPA. We need to make this process a lot faster. We need to change the judicial review standard for these projects so that we don't have courts that are sending back NEPA, finding small NEPA violations and then vacating certificates or stopping projects when the whole purpose of NEPA is disclosure. So we need to reform the Clean Water Act process, we need to reform the NEPA process, we need to reform the judicial process around those things.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Tarpley, you mentioned that production from the Gulf of America results in some of the lowest carbon barrels of oil. Can you explain why that is?
It's a combination of a number of things. One, we have the best technology in the United States. The companies I represent, they have put billions and billions of dollars into research and development over the years on offshore technology, and we are now seeing the fruits of that technology, and it's getting better every year. We also have the expertise. Our companies are the best in the world. They have the best and the brightest who know how to do these procedures as efficiently as possible. And as we talked about other basins around the world, as they look to develop their own basins, they come to us. They come to our people because we have the best technology and the best expertise.
So it's a function more of the technology, it's not necessarily geography specific?
That's correct, yes.
So do you know how the global offshore expansion happening in Saudi Arabia that you mentioned in your testimony, do you know how that rates in terms of carbon intensity compared with the production that's happening in the Gulf of America?
I think as we've discussed here before, in basins where U.S. companies are using modern technology, the efficiencies are similar.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Representative Magaziner for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. In Rhode Island, where I come from, we are producing offshore energy and building more every day. It's creating American jobs, it's lowering costs, and it's reducing our dependence on foreign energy. But it's not offshore oil drilling that we have in Rhode Island, it's offshore wind. A clean, safe form of energy that has tremendous potential to contribute to American energy dominance. I was very glad to hear some of my colleagues, Representative Kiggins and Ranking Member Ansari, speak about the benefits of offshore wind in their testimony or in their comments. And I'll just say that for us in Rhode Island, it's not just theory. It's not just something that could happen someday. It's happening in Rhode Island. We are living it, and we bring that experience. In Rhode Island, in my district, the first commercial offshore wind farm was built off the coast of Block Island in 2016. It's been spinning for almost a decade now. The South Fork Wind Project is also complete. It's powering 70,000 homes. Those homes are in New York, but the wind farm is located off of Rhode Island. And we're also currently building Revolution Wind, which will power nearly 250,000 homes in Rhode Island, which is close to half of the homes of the entire state, in addition to a couple 100,000 more in neighboring Connecticut. This wind energy is being sold to Rhode Islanders at a below-market price. And I want to make sure everyone hears this. The Revolution Wind contract is going to sell power to Rhode Island at a price of less than 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Our standard residential electricity market rate over the course of a year is 16 cents per kilowatt hour. So Revolution One, the big offshore wind project under construction now, is going to be selling electricity into the grid at about 2/3 the cost to consumers of the market rate. And offshore wind deployment could save New England ratepayers $630 million a year on average, up to $1 billion in some years. So not only do you have the environmental benefits, the cost benefits, you also, of course, have the local construction jobs, and by definition, these jobs are local jobs. Revolution One has created 1,200 direct construction jobs, nearly 100 vessel construction jobs, over 120 port jobs, and 50 vessel crewing jobs that are permanent jobs, maintenance jobs that will be permanent as well. So I invite my colleagues, and last year I brought about a half dozen of our colleagues up to Rhode Island to come see offshore wind in action. Again, for us in Rhode Island, you can actually see it. You can talk to the people who are doing the work. You can talk to the local communities that are adjacent to it. It's not theory. It's not conjecture. It's happening in Rhode Island, and I'd welcome everyone to come and learn from our experience. Like all forms of energy, it's not perfect, and you have to have a thoughtful process for where to site it, to make sure that you're managing impacts on marine life and on incumbent industries. That is why, by the way, it is so important that NOAA Fisheries and other regulators have the staffing that they need to do their jobs. And I'm very concerned that the administration's plans to slash staffing at NOAA will unnecessarily hold up projects that could help lead to American energy dominance. And I'm also frankly concerned that President Trump has been promoting baseless conspiracy theories about wind energy, offshore and onshore. Wind turbines cause cancer. The lights go out when the wind stops, yada, yada, yada. We know this is not true. Like, come to Rhode Island, where we're doing this already, and you will see. And I will give credit, by the way. I don't want to paint with a broad brush. I think that a number of my Republican colleagues, as we've heard today, understand that there are benefits here to offshore wind, and I invite everybody else who wants to learn more, please come on up and visit. We'll organize a trip. I only have less than a minute left, but Mr. Chiasson, I've heard you already in this hearing talk a little bit about the work that you all have done in the offshore wind space, but could you just expand a little bit on what the potential job benefits, the economic benefits are that you have seen happen or that you see potential for if we continue to progress?
Thank you for that question, and I have had the opportunity to visit Block Island, and it was good for me to see. Also went to Denmark and see what they do over there as well about offshore wind. But ultimately, you know, we've already been a player. Our port has been working on retrofitting vessels, as I mentioned earlier, and doing different things as part of the offshore wind market that is happening in the Northeast. So, you know, we're all about an energy addition for our country, but that includes offshore oil and gas, offshore wind, and the like. Anything that is going to be an offshore space, we're happy to be a part of it at Port Fourchon.
All right. I'm out of time and I yield back, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Representative Westerman, the Natural Resources Full Chair.
Thank you, Chairman Stauber, and thank you again to the witnesses for being here today. It's hard to have a discussion about a particular segment of energy without bringing in the whole gamut of energy, so I appreciate the discussion we've had about onshore energy, about wind, but really the focus of this hearing is on the offshore energy, especially in the Gulf. And I know that if we talk about onshore energy, there are concerns about if you start drilling too many wells onshore and you flood the global oil supply, do you make it, would it cause problems where you've overproduced and there's not demand, so you don't have a steady flow of work if the cost of energy goes too low? Those are serious things we need to consider, but today we need to look at the offshore. And Mr. Chiasson, I know you talked about the importance of BOEM's 5-year leasing program. Can you explain how this affects in the long term? We may not be seeing effects of leasing in the past 5 years right now, but what could it mean long term if we don't get, if we only have 3 lease sales over the next 5 years?
Look, we have to be able to estimate our revenues and expenditures for our port when we have something that is, you know, not continuous, no certainty in process. It has the ability to basically give us the inability to be able to plan and so that we can expand the drilling and production in the Gulf of Mexico if and when that is allowed. So it has an impact on our national security. It has an impact on, as I produced for the record earlier, you know, we have an issue with rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, right? We don't have enough rigs to do the expansion that we would want to, because decisions that have been made over the last several years have impacted their ability to stay in our country, because they can get longer contracts overseas than we can give in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America because of the uncertainty in the process.
Thank you. And Mr. Wilson, I know you all do work onshore and offshore. We read about the problems you face onshore getting permits, but can you elaborate? Is it more difficult to work offshore or onshore in the pipeline business? Or maybe distinguish some of the challenges?
Yeah, it probably depends on what state you're in. I mean, offshore, as the testimony has been today, from inception to completion, you're talking about 10 years. So you're talking about a huge amount of capital investment that has to go into place, and you have to have surety. You have to have certainty. When the federal government decides it's not going to lease or it's not going to provide permits that it needs to provide for that offshore production, you're essentially stopping the conveyor belt. And wells in the Gulf of Mexico are very different than wells in the Permian Basin or the Marcellus. They have a very different production curve. And both are essential, and you wouldn't want to do away with either one of them. And when we talk about the amount of energy that comes from the Gulf, 15% of our oil production, 5% of our gas production, that's a huge number. You can't simply say it's only 20%. And so to the extent that we are not continuing to run that conveyor belt, we're going to see declines in that area, and it will impact the American people.
And can you elaborate a little bit more on that uncertainty? If you've got a company, you've got capital that needs to be invested, and what does it do to your outlook on where you invest if there's uncertainty in investment in one spot?
We are going to invest our capital where we have certainty of outcome. And that's just the bottom line. And so to the extent that the federal government decides that there's not going to be certainty in the Gulf, then companies like ours are going to stop investing there.
And can you clarify, oil is one thing, but on gas, is it going to raise the price of gas in the United States if we export more gas?
Absolutely not. We've increased our exports dramatically in the last 7-8 years. We haven't seen an increase in price. We have more than enough gas supply. The only issue is permitting and infrastructure.
And while I don't think 10 seconds is long enough to talk about permitting, but we will be working on permitting in this committee as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I now recognize Representative Crank for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Howell, you characterized offshore oil and gas development as being solely about the money, I think is essentially what you said. Let's set aside the fact that this industry is essential for powering our homes, ensuring our national security and our national defense, and maintaining our transportation systems. Just a yes or no question. Are you aware that the United States is currently over $36 trillion in debt, with each American effectively owing more than $106,000? I am. Did you know that the Congressional Budget Office projects that under current spending trends, 50% of every dollar collected will soon be allocated solely to servicing the debt?
I am.
I emphasize the importance of affordable energy. In the Pacific Northwest, hydropower provides electricity at rates as low as 5 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour, while wind power in the same region was projected to cost as much as 84 cents per kilowatt hour. And it might not be about the money for you, but for families struggling to pay their utility bills, businesses trying to stay competitive in a nation striving to maintain energy security, affordability is critical. And I would say, without reliable and cost-effective energy, the economic stability and national defense capabilities that underpin modern American life are put at serious risk. My colleague talked about wind power. I'm for wind power. I'm not for wind subsidies. I'm not for any kind of subsidies to these industries. But I was interested to note that he didn't talk about birds getting hit by wind turbines. We sort of selectively choose the types of energy that we think are good or not good, rather than letting the market take place on those things. I would just ask, Mr. Wilson, I would ask you, do you know, what other countries are doing offshore drilling in the world?
Pretty much anybody who can. Russia, certainly. Qatar, certainly. In Africa, they're going to have to rely on offshore drilling to get the energy they need.
What's the difference in environmental standards between those countries and the United States? Is the United States, would you say we're one of the cleaner ones?
I would say we are the cleanest.
Yeah. So what's the impact if they're doing it to the globe versus us doing some of it here and exporting that energy?
If we are not producing oil and gas for export, they will produce it, and it'll be a lot dirtier.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Chiasson, any thoughts on that?
I think Mr. Wilson said it exactly correct. If we need to be aggressively producing energy, whatever that energy is, in our country, because we have a need in our country, and there's a need around the world. And if we can provide cleaner energy, whatever that type of energy may be, for ourselves and for people around the world, we need to be doing that.
Okay. Mr. Tarpley?
I agree, and I think a lot of the discussion earlier, we need to just make a point here, this talk of the sacrifice zones and indicating that you can't produce oil and gas and have a good community, that should be summarily rejected. It just simply isn't true. I live in the Gulf Coast, 370,000 people that work offshore live in the Gulf Coast. We have an excellent community. We vacation there, we swim in the ocean, it's beautiful, there's tourism. We can have both, and I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, it's a false choice, much like saying if you get in your car to drive somewhere, you're going to die in a car crash. I mean, it doesn't mean you're going to die. There is that potential, but it is a false choice, a false narrative created by many. You're shaking your head, Ms. Howell.
Oh,
You
I'd love to
disagree?
respond to that. Do you live next to a refinery?
You're
Chemical plant?
not to ask
The
the
chair,
other
the
witness.
chair, the
I
chair
forgot, I
intervened.
forgot.
Ma'am, you can't ask the other panelists. You're
Thank
here to
you.
take the questions, and I'm going to give Representative Crank 10 seconds back.
Okay, all right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Crank, can I have your remaining time?
You certainly can,
Thank you
Mr.
very
Chairman.
much.
Yield it.
So one of the things that we really have to look at too from the start to finish in the, building the windmills and what have you, is the minerals that go into them. We haven't talked about that. In a windmill, between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds of copper go into them. And we have an administration, and many colleagues on the other side of the aisle would rather not have that copper mined in the United States. In northeastern Minnesota, we've been mining iron ore that's made U.S. steel, 80% of United States steel. This administration shut down the Duluth complex, which is the biggest copper nickel find in the world, with trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of opportunities. And so we look at that, you look at where those mineral comes from, and that's for another discussion, because I think you'll find that some of these countries are mining these with child forced labor. And the chair now recognizes Representative Gosar from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, there isn't oceanfront property in Arizona, but we're still waiting, at least not yet. But offshore energy dominance is crucial for my state, just as it is for those of the Gulf of America. More offshore leads to lower energy prices and therefore more economic security for working Americans. When the industry is certain that it can deploy needed infrastructure without undue regulatory burden, then it can grow and thrive, helping to achieve energy dominance. Now, I didn't say lack of accountability. You didn't hear that part from me. But we do need to pursue other forms of certainty too. Take 3 Mile Island. It came out of the mothballs just now for 20 years of dependability and energy, talking about these big platforms. That's why pursuits like President Trump's Sovereign Welfare Fund and my act, the Lasso Act, are very important, because I trust the American people to do something about this. And Mr. Chiasson, I want to say thank you very much to your answer to Ms. Hagerman's aspect in regards for the American people. Because what this Lasso Act does is it puts Social Security in that fund so that they can actually help develop it. I trust the American people to make those decisions. Now, you also brought Mr. Tarpley and Mr. Chiasson. You talked about 10 years from discovery to getting something out of it. Boy, that's a touch in a bucket. I mean, we've got Resolution Copper talking 30 years, 30 plus years, and we're still going, okay? So President Biden's 625 million acre OCS withdrawal was an attack on the American energy dominance. He committed a similar assault in my state, where he created a 1.6 million acre national monument adjacent but not in the Grand Canyon, restricting uranium mining. And I'd love to have a conversation about that one too. So you're familiar with also the technology that we export, right, Mr. Chiasson, Mr. Tarpley? How did that affect Lithuania? Can you talk a little bit about
Sir, I can't answer. I don't.
Well, what happened is Lithuania wanted to change away from Russia. And what we had is we didn't have a way to get them the liquefied natural gas. So what you folks did in the energy cycle is you put together these big containers, you liquefied it. They invested in a ship that they actually could decompress it into their gas lines, and voila, they were very independent. So very, very touching. Next one I want to bring out is a blue whale discovery in Vietnam. Okay, so once again, big, huge national asset for them. And what are they doing? They're doing it cleanly because of American natural gas and exploration. I think that's very incredible what you guys do. You're exporting it as well as the techniques, but as well as the energy. Now, I heard a lot of things. I was very upset to hear some of the comments that were used here this morning, just like Mr. Begich from Alaska. You know, these terminologies using, I want to make sure I had this right. Energy sacrifices. Ms. Howell, you can't believe in that, do you?
I don't know what you're referring to.
Well, we had a gentleman over here from California talk about energy sacrifices, sacrificial zones. Come on now, that's not hardly a conversation worth mattering. That's a name calling, right?
Well, I think the name calling might have started with Chairman Stauber's remark about radical environmental extremists.
Well, you know, I'll tell you something about that. We're going to find out something about that.
I agree.
Yeah. We're going to find out from IRS records about who's giving to who on these NGOs. I think that transparency is everything. I'm happy about transparency. Let's let the people decide. Let's bring the transparency out, okay? So, but I think hardly that is a discussion about energy. So we're going to need more energy or less energy coming up here, Mr. Chiasson?
We need more.
How about you, Ms. Tarpley?
We need a lot more.
Ms. Wilson?
We're going to need a lot more.
How about you, Ms. Howell?
I agree.
Okay, I mean, I go on my 303 part of my district, it's a road, and every 2 weeks we have a new building going up. And guess what? It's all these data centers. Oh, by the way, I brought up 3 Mile Island, right? Do you know why 3 Mile Island came on board? For exactly that, for data centers. So they're competing with the national folk who are trying to get these affordable prices across the board. Do you see that being in competition, Mr. Chiasson?
Competition? I think it's, AI is going, that data centers are going to be taking more power, more energy than we can produce right now.
But competition is going to actually lower the price, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. How about you, Mr. Wilson?
I'd agree with that.
How about you, Mrs.?
I think competition across all forms of energy is critical.
Thank you very much. And you, Mr. Tarpley?
I agree. Competition's good.
Thank you. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last, Representative Tiffany from Wisconsin.
Last and least, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are deciding who's going to win the 21st century right now with these decisions that are being made across America. Is this going to be a Chinese century, or is this going to be an American century? And energy production is at the heart of it. So, Mr. Wilson, I want to take you up to Line 5 in my neck of the woods, northern Wisconsin, Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And there are organizations that are doing everything possible to stop that line from being upgraded. What's going to happen if they are successful? And what's going to happen if they get their way and they're able to shut down Line 5?
It's going to be harder to get energy into this country. And it's going to impact the American consumers. Prices, you'll have some impact on price, and you really won't have any environmental benefit. In fact, if they continue to bring the energy into the U.S. using other means, it's going to have a larger environmental footprint.
What, if you were to name one single permitting change, what would it be?
I'd roll the Clean Water Act 401 permit into the FERC NEPA process.
401 into?
The FERC NEPA process.
Why is that?
FERC already does a water quality analysis. Look, every state should have its say. They should be able to provide input into these permits, but they shouldn't be able to veto these permits any more than they should be able to veto an interstate highway. And so you roll that into a process that is already occurring, is already robust, and already determines whether or not we're meeting the Clean Water Act.
So it's duplicative?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm going to yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
Thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. I think that one of the things I think you heard on both sides of the aisle, all of the above energy, all of the best will rise to the top. As I gave my example of heating our homes in the northern climates, it's not going to be possible at this moment for alternative intermittent sources of energy to keep me and my family alive. And what we need, I think what we need to do is again, all of the above. I support all of the above. All of the best will rise to the top. For me, if we go to the mining sector, I just talked to you about the copper, nickel, cobalt, other platinum group metals that go into these windmills. I went, Alan Lowenthal, the chair of this committee, when I was a freshman, invited me out to California on a wind energy project he wanted me to see. And we went out there. I specifically asked the developers about the critical minerals that go into there. I said, can you guarantee that they will be mined in this country under the best environmental labor standards? And he said, absolutely not. And so I'm looking at my economy up in northern Minnesota. Why would you not agree to mine domestically when these materials are there? Why would you allow child forced labor to provide you with those minerals? That's the frustration that I have. We can mine domestically and do it right. In the Inflation Reduction Act, there was $7.4 billion put aside for electric charging stations. The Biden administration removed the Buy American provisions for the critical minerals in there. You know why? Because he didn't want mining in this country to mine those minerals that we have abundantly. Just like the oil and gas industry can lead not only this country, but the world and how they produce it clean, we can mine these critical minerals and lead the world into that. So I would ask Ms. Howell, as you go back and promote your wind energy, that you actually look into those minerals that are mined in the wind generation itself and where they come from, where do you get that from? I would submit to you, let's push for American critical mineral dominance and not other foreign nations that we know use child slave labor. So with that, we are going to conclude this hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members for the questions. The members of this subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, February 14th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peg, nice to meet you.
Likewise.